All right, let's talk about anger. Anger. What I forgot was I made a list of other words that we use instead of anger to kind of get by, like euphemisms, and I left it in my office. So annoyed, I'm feeling annoyed, is not nearly as bad as angry, or irritated, or frustrated, or exasperated, or provoked. I guess provoked is when, I would never have done that if she hadn't done this or he hadn't done that. Anyway, those are other words that we use for anger. So as I use this and we're talking, all of those words actually mean anger. But while the meat was still between their teeth and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Numbers 11:33. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die." 2 Samuel 12:5. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Ephesians 4:26 and 27. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Ephesians 4:31. So few things destroy people faster or more completely than anger. It crushes those it is unleashed upon, and it shatters the person who's gotten angry. It often destroys every kind of relationship, and even when forgiveness has been requested and granted, things just don't seem to be the way they were before. It just messes us up. It destroys relationships, it destroys homes, it destroys churches, it destroys governments, it destroys businesses. Uncontrolled and sinful anger is a terrible, terrible behavior or emotion. And I think when we talk about it, we'll notice behavior and emotion are really kind of the same thing in these cases. There's an example of this anger. Incidentally, I don't remember if we've done the bitterness talk yet or not, but bitterness is anger that hasn't been expressed. It's been shoved down and not controlled, and it comes out eventually, and it comes out in a rage, usually. But when I was doing my internship in Northern California for my master's degree, I got to the church about 3 years after they had just had a church split. And it was a congregational government in the church, and the way that the church did it was they voted on what they were going to do, and they voted. And the vote was they had an odd number of people, and that was exactly halfway down the middle with one vote excommunicating essentially the other half of the congregation, the whole congregation. And the way the whole thing started was they had a church potluck a couple of years earlier, and a woman and her sister-in-law had a little altercation. And really what it was one of them looked across the room where the party was happening, and the other one looked up, and she said, "You looked at me in a bad way, like you were mad at me for something." And the lady denied it. The sister-in-law denied it, that she did it. She didn't remember ever even looking up, let alone looking at her in a bad way, or she didn't remember having a bad thought, and she loved her, and it was wonderful, and it's glad to see you, and thanks for coming, but she didn't let it go. The first one wouldn't let it go. You looked at me bad. You need to apologize. You need to confess your sin, and I need to forgive you, and we need to go through the whole process. And the second one then would not give in to that because she hadn't looked at her badly. She didn't think badly of her. She wasn't going to confess any sin. She hadn't done it. It didn't happen, never happened. And then those two angry women talked to everybody else in the church, and everybody took sides in the church, until pretty soon the whole church was polarized, one with this lady and one with the other lady. And in the end, they had a vote about who was going to stay and who was going to go, and it was one vote cast the difference between people staying in the church. And when I got there, that's what it was. It was a church of half the size it was before. And one of the ways that I found out about it was I would go into the office, and my office was upstairs in the back. And right across the street from the church lived a lady who had been on the side that got booted out. And she was really friendly, and I talked to her all the time. And I asked the pastor, how come she's not coming to our church? And he told me this story. She was on the side that got booted, so when she went to church on Sunday morning, I saw her get into her car and drive to another church instead of walking across the street to our church. Pretty crazy. Yeah, and a thing that added to it was that the pastor at the time, he was not the pastor who was there when I was there, the pastor at the time had been out one foggy night. It was in Northern California, lots and lots of fog that you drive in that fog and you can only see like 3 feet in front of you. And it's a logging community. And he was out one night, and it's a little tiny town. The church is there. There's a fire engine there, and it's a little spot, a post office and a grocery store hooked together, mom and pop kind of store. And it was like a block away. And he was out one night, went over to working in his office, and he went across the street to get a cup of coffee or something. And on his way back, he wandered out into the street, and a logging truck came along and blasted him, just obliterated him. And when they went to, put everything back together and went to his desk, he had one of those big yellow legal pads on his desk, and across the front of it he had written, "What am I going to do with these people?" And both sides blamed the other side for his death on top of everything else. But anger was the center of the whole thing. One lady was angry because her sister-in-law looked at her bad, and the other lady got angry after that because she wasn't angry with her sister. Didn't look at her bad, didn't even look at her. So anger can really, 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 really mess you up. Anger is an emotion, usually followed by some kind of subsequent action. And sometimes it's followed a long time afterwards. And that's when it turns into bitterness. And then as the Bible says, it explodes and comes out in all kinds of horrible ways. Anger usually builds on a number of other factors: the person's overall perspective on life, the person's understanding of himself, the person's understanding of the particular situation, and how he's been trained to act in various situations, and many more. So a person who gets angry, their perspective on life usually is that they're the center of the universe, and whatever's going on is not to their liking, and that can't be. We just can't have that. Even you look at two little kids playing in the yard. They're 18 months old, 2 years old, and one of them goes over to get the truck from the other one and takes it from him. Gets mad, takes it away. The other one gets mad and whacks him with the other truck. Or the first one takes the truck in an angry huff and then takes it over and sets it down and doesn't even play with it. There's self-absorption going on there. I'm the center of the universe, the king of the playground, whatever it is. I'm the center. The person's understanding of himself. I am the one. I rule. I reign. Nobody else is going to get what I have. The person's understanding of the situation. Often, it's amazing how often people get angry and they were totally wrong about what they understood was happening. It was just weird. When one couple came for counseling and they had had a big fight during the week, and it was over their nightlight. They had been building a house, and they just finished their house and moved in, and it wasn't really finished, how that happens. And he got up in the night, and it was dark, and he ran into the door, and he decided that he needed a nightlight. So the next day, he went to the dollar store, and he bought a nightlight, and he plugged it in, and it was one of those goofy ones that changes color. And he got up in the night, and he went to the bathroom, and the light was changing color, and his wife saw that changing color thing and just went in ballistic about it. Why did you buy that? What are you thinking? What was going on with that? And he before he could even explain, he just bought it for the one night so that he was going to wire the whole house with night lights, and so that when you moved, they came on when you needed them, and just where you needed them, and just the amount you needed, really fancy ones. That's what he had in his head. But she just went nuts on him. And then because she was angry with him, he got angry with her, and then they got angry with each other, and they never talked about the nightlights anymore after a couple of sentences. It was all about who's in charge, who gets to call the shots. So there's two types of anger in the Bible. There's righteous anger. It's not sinful. There's unrighteous anger that is sinful. And the following are a few examples from the Bible of when the anger was not sinful. So God expresses anger with sinful mankind in Psalm 7:11, and I mentioned one here in Numbers 11, where God, his anger, 7:11, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and then he did something with that. Psalm 7:11, Exodus 4:14, Deuteronomy 29:27, and on and on. Jesus became angry with his disciples in Mark 3:5, and he was angry with the money changers. We usually we think about that one. He was angry with the money changers and cast them out in John 2, and a couple of other Gospels record the story. Paul was angry with the Athenians in Acts 17, and he told the Ephesians to be angry but do not sin in Ephesians 4:26. So in that one, he says, be angry and don't sin, which shows that it's possible to be angry and not sin. Right? So not all anger is sinful. We do oftentimes think that it is. It's always sinful whenever anybody's angry, but it isn't always sinful when people get angry. Unrighteous anger, or sinful anger, springs up when we believe that an injustice has occurred. And usually it's about us. It's an injustice against us. Something has happened that I didn't deserve, something that I didn't want is happening, or something that I did want isn't happening. And so I get angry. Or sometimes it's happening, but it's happening slower than I want, or not in the same way that I want it. It's not exactly what's going on. Sometimes we can get nitpicky about things and we just can get into it. But at the end of the day, we are unrighteously angry when we're angry because something we want is not happening or is happening that we don't want. We sin when we wrongly believe that an injustice has occurred and act on that wrong assumption. And when we believe that it is unjust because of our pride or self-esteem has been brought into question. They're all tied together. When viewing the situation through the eyes of God, an injustice has, in fact, not occurred. Now, I think there are times when injustices have occurred and we just do it badly. We respond in a way that is ungodly. I think that things can happen to us that are unjust, and we can respond to them in godly ways, and we can also respond to things sinfully when things genuinely happen to us. But if we get angry in an unjust way, it's because you're doing what you're doing to me. That's ungodly anger. If there's a way, and I think there is a way, that you can be upset with someone for doing something to you, and you're genuinely angry at them for their sin in the process, not about what it's doing to you, then I think you can be angry that way. But it's really, really hard to sort those two things out, because James says, as we'll get to in a minute, James says that we get angry because we want something and we don't get it, and we don't want something and we do get it. It's our hearts that well up. But we've sinfully put ourselves in the place of God, and we decide what's just and what's unjust. And many times the thing done to us is not an injustice at all. We've just overshot it. We're not reading it right. We're straining out gnats and swallowing camels, and we're making mountains out of molehills. And it's all about us. It's not really the instance that's the problem. And you can do this when you're talking to somebody. You can show this where if you change the story, the way Nathan did with David, you say, let's take this same exact story, and I don't say it this way when I'm doing counseling. I don't say, let's take the same exact story. I just change the story, and I say, let's take another instance of this that's over here. And George and Bill are having this discussion. He just describes a discussion. They're having a discussion. It's not about lights, it's about something else, and I change that. And it's really easy for people to see this being sinfully angry, even though they don't see this as being sinfully angry. It's very interesting. But when you're over here talking about this over here, it's easy to point out and say, how is what my illustration person did different than what you did in this discussion? How are they different? And people then will go, yeah, okay, I see what you're talking about. That was bad. Our anger is sinful when it involves brooding or fretting. Psalm 37, especially verse 8. When we keep a running account of wrongs, Leviticus 19 and 1 Corinthians 13. When we pretend we're not angry, when we justify our anger, when we return evil for anger, Proverbs 29, 11 and 22. When we attack a substitute, Matthew 5, 21 and 22, and 1 Samuel 20. In 1 Samuel 20, Saul goes after Jonathan because he's angry with David. In this last one, brooding or fretting and all these kinds of things includes yelling at a pillow or punching a bag or yelling at the counselor. Sometimes, if you go to secular counseling and you tell the people you have an anger issue, that's sometimes how they tell you to handle it, is just to go in the other room and yell at a pillow, punch a wall, not punch walls because you break walls, or break hands or something, but it's vent your anger in some way that isn't against the person, and somehow that helps you. In my experience and the experience of lots of other people I've read about, handling it that way just makes it worse because you don't actually get rid of it. You don't actually dealing with it. You're not actually thinking about it correctly. You're still the center of the universe. So righteous anger, on the other hand, will have these characteristics. The godly man or woman will be wise. He'll see the big picture, Proverbs 29:11, and he won't let his emotions rule him. He knows what's going on. He sees outside of it. He's able to step back and see a bigger picture of what's happening. You see this going here and this going there and that happening here, and you're not involved in it. It's not about you. It's about what's going on out there. And so if something is happening that's unjust, that's genuinely unjust, you can be, sometimes I've even seen it before where people actually weren't all that angry before, but the situation needed someone to be angry to handle it right, and so they ginned up the anger to handle it correctly, chose to be angry. And I think that's one way to do it. He's wise. He sees the big picture. He knows. For an example of this would be when your children do something ungodly and they need to be spanked, but you don't feel like it. You don't feel like taking them in the other room and talking to them in their face and telling them what's right and what's wrong, and you need to confess that's sin, and you need to confess it to God. You don't feel like doing that. So you have to say, okay, you go in the other room, and I'll sit out here and think about it a while, and you sort of gin up the emotion that you need to go in there to fix the situation without sinning, right? But it's an emotion that you need to have. We can talk about that later if you want to. Second thing, a godly person will analyze the situation. What's going on here? What's at the heart of this issue or an event? Counselors need to be able to do that. What is happening here? What is going on? And the 7 questions we mentioned in previous talks, and will some more in others, really help to get to all that. What was actually going on in the heart of the people that we're talking about? Why did the lady get upset at the lights that her husband put in? Why did she not ask him about it before she told him about it? Stuff like that. What was happening in other areas of life? The third one, a godly person will ask, what's my role in this situation? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to do anything at all? Am I supposed to just sit here and ask God to deal with it? And vengeance is mine, says God, I will repay. So sometimes we're called to not do anything at all, except maybe bless the person. We bless our enemies, and we pour burning coals on their heads. We love our enemies, and we give them to God and let God deal with them. We say, God, they're yours. You take it. Here, you have them. You can do that. What's my role? What's God called me to do in this instance? And sometimes it is simply to let God have it. Other times it's to come up with a way to deal with the situation that diffuses the situation, that doesn't make it worse. Those kinds of things. The fourth one I have is be content to let God take vengeance and orchestrate the right punishment for evildoers. The wise person understands that he's not been called to act for God in this instance. One of the ways that I word that a lot is, yes, this person did an evil thing. Yes, this person is acting in a bad way. This is what they're doing is sinful. But you getting involved in it just makes the situation worse, because the way you get involved in it often is sinful itself, and then the person can blame you for what they're doing. So you need to get out of the situation so that God can get into the situation without you being in the way. You need to get out of the way of God and let God get in there and do stuff. And I need to come up with another way to say that, because that isn't always helpful. But you can illustrate it with something like, let's have an example where the husband comes and says, my wife really treats the kids badly. When they do something wrong, she just goes berserk. And I say, okay, so how are you responding? And I say, well, she gets berserk and I get berserk. And I go in and yell at her, and then she yells at me and I yell at her, and she yells at me and I yell at her, and then it's bad. It's really, really bad. So that would be an example of a time where his initial response, the first thing he says or does, needs to be something different, because he's making it worse by jumping in there and making it bad. The only thing it changes is that she was yelling at the kids, now she's yelling at him. Nothing's really changed in terms of what her sin is doing, except now it's against him. And he's also put himself in the position now where he's sinning too. right? So he's sinning and she's sinning, and they're just ratcheting it up until sometimes fisticuffs happen. Things happen that are really, really bad. So he needs to come up with a way to diffuse the situation without him sinning, and in a way that doesn't cause her to sin all the more against him, and also lets God get in there and talk to her, mess up her hair, do stuff with her so she can see her own sin without blaming it on him or the kids. Does that make sense? So the wise person can look at it from the outside and figure out a way to let God get in there and do things. And a lot of times in those kinds of situations, even if it's the two just themselves, a lot of times things get worse when we're trying to make them better because we're sinning ourselves. And then we both have each other to blame for our sin, and we need to get out of the way and let God deal with it. So let God take vengeance and orchestrate the right punishment for the evildoer. So he understands that he's not been called to act for God in this instance. And if he's been called, a prison official, for instance, he will do his duty with aplomb and trepidation. So let's say he's the prison guy and he's supposed to lock these people up in prison. And in prison, everybody, it's the weirdest thing if you, I don't know if you've ever been, have any of you ever been in prison? I'm not raising my hand about that one. When I was in the Navy, I was assigned a job to be what they call the chaser. And what that meant was I had to wear my dress uniform and go to the brig every day and escort prisoners out of the brig over to the courts or over to the hospital to get treatment at the hospital and do their have their trials and stuff at the courtroom. But one of the things I was just really, really amazed about was that the prison culture has its own little culture. And I don't know if this is true of other places, but I've seen prison movies, and they kind of do. They do, where the prisoners treat the guards like the prisoners are the prisoners are the free people, and the guards are the guys in prison. It's really the weirdest feeling. And so you walk in with your fancy uniform and all your stripes and your medals and everything, and the first thing that happens is everybody who lives there, who's staying there, they treat you like they're the ones who belong there and you don't belong there. And so I would think that guards who work in prisons have to understand that they have to remember that you're actually going home tonight, and you're the free one. They're not the free ones. They're in jail for a reason, and you have to just maintain yourself and stay calm and cool and do what your job says to do. So that's what I'm talking about here. Be careful to do what you're called to do, and realize that God's in charge of the whole situation, and you're called, like you're the guy who throws the switch. You're not doing that out of anger. You're doing that out of your job. It's what you do. That's what I'm called here to do. The fifth one is be constructive in his. The person who's righteously angry is constructive in his confrontation with the others involved in the incident. So Galatians 6:1, Matthew 7:1-5. Galatians 6:1 says, "You find your brother in sin, you who are spiritual, go to him and restore him gently." So let's say your first thought is, I'm really, really angry about this whole thing. Well, you calm yourself down, get out of, if you were sinning in that, calm yourself down so that you don't stay in sin. Calm yourself down and restore them gently. The goal is restoration, not being right and fixing things. Matthew 7 is a passage about helping your brother remove the speck from his eye. We usually consider that one the passage that talks about how to get the log out of your own eye or not be judgmental. But really, it's all about how to help your brother get the speck out of his eye. And you do that by getting yourself out of the way, by taking the log out of your own eye, then you're qualified to take the speck out of his eye. That was cool. Okay, number 6, forgiving. Forgiving, again, means not remembering. So there are times when a godly person gets stirred all up, is tempted to be angry, and simply forgiving the person gets rid of the anger in a godly way. You don't get angry when you're forgiving. And joyfully move on. Those kind of fit together. You're forgiven, you're forgiving, you're joyfully moving on. And I think the forgiving one applies even if the person doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't, you have it all wrapped up in a package. We've talked about this before. It's all wrapped up like a package with a big bow on it, ready to go. And the person, or whatever the situation is that's made you be tempted to be angry, you go through it in your mind where you give it to God, you give them to God, you give the situation to God, and you don't get angry, and you get ready, and you go off whistling a happy tune, a joyful tune. You're joyful, and you go off skipping skipping and hopping down the street. He'll do this even if he hasn't the opportunity to confront. He has faith that God is faithful to do what God wants done. So an angry person who's godly will let God deal with the situation when it's necessary. And when he's called to do something about it, he does it in a completely different way than he would do if it was all about him. So let's talk a second about where anger comes from. In James 4, the Bible tells us that we become angry when our passions are aroused, and we either can't get what we want or we get what we don't want. And out of this springs fights and quarrels and murder. It goes all the way back to what we think about ourselves with regard to the universe. What is our perspective of things? We need to know that our perspective is governed by what's in our hearts. And our hearts are the center or the core of our being. So essentially, everything that we think, do, or say is a heart thing. We've said that lots of times before. We all know that. So out of the evil of our hearts comes this desire to have whatever this other person has or not have whatever the person is doing to us. Those kinds of things. We get angry because we want what we want. We get upset because we're not getting what we want. And that's a heart thing. What do we think? What do we feel? What do we do when things get hot reveals our hearts. It produces our thoughts, motives, intentions, behaviors, etc. When who we are in our heart is who we actually are, and who we are is expressed when things get hot, when things are happening, when things are bouncing around, things get tight, you're lacking sleep, you're a little bit sick, you don't feel good, you're hungry. Those kinds of things make the heart clearer to pop out and come out. And so what comes out is what's in our hearts. In the Theology of Christian Counseling, J. Adams has this to say about the heart's involvement in our thoughts and behaviors. In order to help us better understand the biblical meaning of heart, let us ask, what then is set over against the heart, if anything? The answer is always, without exception, the visible outer man. Worship that one gives with his lips, outer, visible, audible worship, when his heart, or inner, invisible, inaudible, is far from God, is a good example of this contrast, Matthew 15:8. We are instructed that man looks on the outward appearance, but in contrast, God looks on the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7. Without multiplying references, it's safe to say that anywhere the Bible uses the word heart to speak of the inner man, or as Peter puts it in a thoroughly definitive way, the hidden person of the heart, plainly then, the heart in the Bible is the inner life that one lives before God and himself, a life that is unknown by others because it is hidden from them. So we can hide the heart from people, and we can do all kinds of stuff, but the heart pops out when anything hard happens. It's the middle of the night, you wake up, you're startled, something's happening. How do you respond? What's the first thing out of your mouth? What happens? Reveals your heart. When you're startled, when you're sick, when you're tired, those kind of things reveal your heart. And so we're constantly doing things, especially in the area of anger, to train our hearts to respond differently, to be different, so that they react differently to different situations. So the following are some of the underlying characteristics that come along with anger and their godly counterparts. So with anger, pride, we've mentioned that before. Pride is there. I want what I want, so I do what I do. I think what I think. I'm not getting what I want, so I get angry. The response is to be humble, to think more highly of the person, to think more highly of God than yourself, to think more highly of everyone around you than you think of yourself, to actually stop thinking about yourself altogether and just think about service and serving and godly serving and joyful serving. Defensiveness is another thing that pops out. Actually, defensiveness is kind of sometimes the angry response that we see. It's defensive. Like as I mentioned before, in most fights, the second or third sentence is not about the thing that brought it up in the first place. It's the second or third sentence is now one or both of the people involved being defensive. You can't talk to me that way. Who do you think you are? I'm the center of the universe. Don't you realize that if you realized who I was, you'd be bowing down in the dirt and groveling for my assistance? Nobody says that, but isn't that what's happening? That's what you're saying. And then the next sentence says, oh yeah? Back at you, the same thing. If you knew who I was, you'd be, the same thing. But that's kind of what defensiveness is. I respond that way because I'm feeling pushed on. I'm getting beat on or verbally. It's bad. And meekness is the proper response. So someone yells at you, and meekness is your response. Yeah, okay, yeah, I kind of deserve that. Yes, you're totally right. I am a schmo. Yes, yes, and yes, yes, yes. Give me more. I need more. That's all. You only know the half of it. If you knew the whole truth, you'd be way worse than you are. Control. I must rule or have power. I must rule and have power. I am the center of the universe. I need to control every little thing that happens. And it's funny is sometimes this control thing, we're angry when we actually don't have control and we finally realize it. And it isn't always just that this person isn't doing what I want them to do. It's that there's too many plates in the air, too many things going on, and I can't control them all. And I realize that I can't, so I'm angry with that. It isn't necessarily that I'm angry with the person that I'm not controlling. Again, the answer is faith in God. What is God doing in all of this? Is God competent to control all the plates that I have in my life? Is he competent to get done what actually needs to get done? Or do I need to control every little thing? And if I have faith in God, then I realize I don't need to control everything because he's God, not me. Fear produces anger. I might get hurt or I might die. Usually it's not the die part. People don't usually think about dying in those instances when they're really, really angry. Sometimes there's things about dying in there that you're trying to avoid death, actually. But at the end of the day, both of them, the right response is to trust God. If things are really, really bad, they could be really, really bad. They could be really, really, really bad. But where's God in all this? Where's God here? Is he in charge or not? What's the worst thing that could happen if you did die? You'd go to be with the Lord. It's not that big a deal. So we need to have those fears be translated and transposed from being afraid that this is going to hurt or I'm going to die, to letting God handle it and take care of it. If it hurts, he's got stuff figured out. If I die, I'll go to be with him. It'll be great. I don't need to get angry about everyone around me. You love all the wrong things. And I think I'm going to stop after this one, but you can read through the list. And we get angry when we love all the wrong things. We take things that are not important and we elevate them to spots in our lives that is way above where they need to be. And we take the thing or the event or something and we put it higher than all the people around us. And then we get angry with the people around us because they don't share that conviction about how important those things are. I think an example that pops in my head right now is doing the dishes. How often parents can get angry with their kids for not doing the dishes or not doing them right, and sinfully angry. I told you to do the dishes. I told you last night. I told you the night before. I told you tonight. What's the deal? And you just go on them like they just killed 37 people, and you're really, really angry with them. And really, what's the deal there? You've taken things out of proportion. You're loving the wrong thing. You're loving the dishes more than you love your kid. And you need to take it right. Think about it the way God thinks about it. Understand their frame. Sometimes their frame needs you to be angry, but you need to have it be a godly, controlled anger, not an out of control, I'm in charge of the universe kind of anger. That kind of thing. So you can go through all of these on your own and look at those. So how do you counsel an angry person? Well. The answer depends according to what the situation is. It's one of those it depends kind of answers. Does he know that he has a problem with anger, and does he want help? Those are actually two different things. Does he know that he's angry? Sometimes people don't. They don't know that they're angry. I've had guys who they just sit there and say, I'm not an angry person. Their wife's sitting there, all wrapped up in a ball saying, he's really an angry person. You need to talk to him. And he says, I'm not angry. I don't know what she's talking about. And I said to her, so give me an example. This is what you do. You say to her, give me an example of when you think he's being angry. Because she could be wrong, right? He may not be angry. She could be wrong. He's just a happy-go-lucky guy, and everything is roses, and it's really nice. Probably not. But you say, so give me an example. And so she says, okay, so just yesterday. Yes, just yesterday. Little Johnny was out in the yard, and he threw the ball, and it bonked into the side of the truck and put a dent in the truck. And he just went ballistic. He just started screaming and yelling and dragged Johnny in the house and started wailing on him and spanking him for being so careless and throwing the ball and hitting the truck. And I say to him, so what would you say? How would you describe that story? You remember that story? Were you there? And he says, yeah, I was there. And I said, and I've had guys who just sit there straight-laced, straight-faced, and say, I wasn't angry. I said, what were you? Were you just really calm and you just said, little Johnny, let's go have a little chat? And you walked calmly in the house and we had this talk and you talked about being irresponsible or careless or something. And he said, well, no. I said, how would you describe that emotion that you had right then? You were emotional, right? He says, oh, yeah, I was emotional, but I wasn't angry. What were you? I was frustrated. Oh, okay. So what does frustrated mean? What does that mean? And sometimes I'll actually do this. I'll get my dictionary out. I'll get my screen and I'll turn it. I'll look up the word frustrated and see what the word means. And it means angry. I mean, that's what it means. It's just a euphemism for angry. And it's a word that people use to not say angry because they know anger is a sin. The Bible says anger is a sin, but it doesn't say anything about frustrated. So when I say this to him, sometimes I've had guys who genuinely appear, at least they appear, to genuinely not think that being frustrated is being angry. And when those two things are put together, they just crash. They just fall all apart and they just go, golly, I have been angry for years. I've been angry my whole life. In fact, I can't remember a time when I wasn't angry. And before that, 10 minutes earlier, they were never angry. That wasn't their problem. That wasn't a big deal. So I say, okay, so go home and confess all your sin of anger. Every time you can think of that you were angry, confess that. And they genuinely do, and they're good, and they get angry still occasionally, but they're not characterized by anger anymore. So that's an easy one. That's pretty easy. But there's other times when they don't know it. Usually that kind of thing happens when they genuinely don't know it, and you explain it what it is, and then they go, yeah, that's me. And then if they want help, now we have a different story. If they don't want help, then if they're members of our church, we start talking about the Lord's Supper and not having it and that kind of sin, and we need to help you with this. You need to stop doing this because this is sin. This is really, really bad sin. And then we give them a bunch of passages of Scripture to look up to show them that they don't get to sin. So if they want help, so that's the next thing. Does he know he has a problem and wants help? Or another one is, does he know he has a problem and doesn't want help? I just mentioned that one. Does he know something's wrong, but he doesn't know what it is? I've had people like that who have come to my office and said, there's something wrong, nobody likes me, and I don't know why. And so then I ask them for illustration. How do you know they don't like you? And because. And I say, okay, tell me a story that goes with that because. Explain to me what you're talking about. Why do you think they don't like you? And they'll tell me stories where things happen and they get mad and stomp out, or they get mad and yell and holler, and they get mad and call people names, all kinds of stuff like that. And then we just go through those 7 questions with that event, each one of those events, and then we start they see that they're angry, and we start helping them figure out how to go into situations where they might get angry, ready for it so they don't get angry when the situation happens, when the temptation comes. So the response to each one of these questions would prompt a slightly different direction to take in the counseling process. Sometimes we go through books together. I have several books, I have them listed here in your notes, about anger, how different authors have written books on anger and how to handle it. So sometimes we'll take like a chapter or two a week and we'll go through it, and I'll say, we'll go through it together. I'll read it, you read it, I'll mark it up, you mark it up. We come back together, we'll talk about the stuff that we marked and why we marked it and how it's going to be helpful for my application of life. And I do that a lot with counseling. I just take we take books on the topics and we read them. Sometimes, like anger may be one of those where the problem doesn't need to be talked about for a really long time. In other words, you don't need to say, I'm not going to be angry, I'm not going to be angry, I'm not going to be angry. Sometimes you don't need to do that. It's not helpful because you're always thinking like, I'm not going to think about pink elephants, and that's all you do is think about pink elephants. So we go into another book. We'll go to something like Reforming Marriage, or we'll go to a book that talks about how to do right things, Disciplines of a Godly Man, or ladies do Disciplines of a Godly Woman, or Another one might be feelings and faith, where it looks like in some ways that the thing that you're talking about after you've dealt with the fact of anger and the confession of sin of anger, you're talking about something that doesn't appear to be related, but it's definitely related, really, because this is about how to be a full-orbed, godly person, and this is just one of the sins involved in a person who's not a really godly person. Does that make sense? So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what not to do, because when we turn away from sin into godliness or righteousness, the best way to turn away is often by turning to. So I want to spend a lot of time turning to godly things. So I give them homework that relates to that. So, So we give homework, and again, the homework is for them to meet with God. We give homework from the Bible so that studying it will reveal that God is God. And most of these instances of anger have to do with selfishness and pride, so we want the person reading their Bible to see God in a different way, to see how to relate to God in a different way, and therefore how to relate to different people in a different way. So I often ask people to read Psalm 119, which usually takes a couple of weeks because it's a long psalm, as you know, and pay attention. But if, it's interesting is if people genuinely really take the finger in the eye about their sins seriously, it's amazing what all they can do when you give them homework. How fast they can read stuff and if a guy's really, really serious about fixing his situation with his family or his work people or especially with God, he can read all of Psalm 119 a couple of times without any trouble. It's long, but if you really want to get it and you really want to get fixed, you really will do a whole lot of work. And so I actually am looking for that in giving people homework. So I ask them to read Psalm 119 and pay attention to who God is and who the psalmist is and what his situation is and what is his attitude toward God and his law and the emotion he displays toward God. And the goal here, and also to ask God to change him into a guy who's like the psalmist. I think we've talked about this in other lectures because I use the same homework for a lot of different problems. But the person I say, you need to read the psalm, and as you're reading it, notice all these things, but also at the same time, ask God to make you into someone like the psalmist is. You want to think about God the way the psalmist thinks about God. You want to think about the scriptures and the law and the oracles and the promises and all the things that are mentioned in the psalm the way the psalmist thinks about those things. And then you need to notice the predicament that the psalmist is in while he's writing this about God, about himself and God. Because your life is not wonderful. You're tempted to do the things that you're doing. You're tempted to be angry. You're genuinely tempted to be angry by things that are happening around you that may actually be sin on the other person's part. My friend with the light, for example, he became really, really sinful and yelled at his wife and was mean and nasty to her. I don't remember that he hit her or anything, but he was really angry, and he was, really, and they were angry at each other for days. But if his attitude toward her had been the way the psalmist's attitude toward God was, then he would have maybe kindly answered her in the first place. Say, honey, I understand what you're talking about. Those lights are really, really crazy. Agree with her. Go with the flow. You don't need to fight with her about it, even though she's all over him about what dunderhead kind of a guy would buy lights like that. Well, that's true if that were the truth. But he only paid $1 for them, and his plan was to buy nicer ones the next day when he had some time. So the goal here is to have God create a new attitude in the person about who God is, who he is before God, what emotions are all about, and how he should begin to think about others in that context. So I want him to do this in the presence of God so God can change him by being in the presence of God. And I have him read Ephesians, and especially emphasize Ephesians 4:26 and 27. I want the counselee to think about how he might become angry and not sin. That's at 4:26 and 27. And I also point him to 4:31 and 32 and ask him to think about how he might obey the first part of the passage and fit the second part into his life in these particular circumstances. But in the whole thing, I want him to meet with God because God changes people. I don't change people. The scriptures by themselves, apart from God, don't change people. It's just written words on a page. They become real as we meet with God in them, and he changes us. We know lots of people you probably all know people who read the scriptures and it doesn't change them at all. It's just words on a page. But when you meet with the living God as you're reading the scriptures, then he comes into your life and transforms you. And so I want to give homework to the people where they meet with God in particular ways so that God can change them into godly people. So when life gets hard and crazy and strange, and they don't get angry. They don't respond the same way. They respond kindly and in love. So, we've been talking about the heart. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're close. There are some people who get angry, and it's really, really bad. I've known people who punch holes in walls. There are people who get so angry that they think they're out of control. I remember my mother screaming at us kids. I remembered this reading it in a book. Somebody talked about this happening in a book, and then I recalled the same thing happening when I was a kid. And my mom we did something, my brother and I probably, or we did it to our sisters or something, I don't know. But we were being yelled at, and my mom was really in a good rage, and she had it really going. And I think at the time, if you had asked her later, was she out of control, she probably would have said, yes, I was out of control. The anger had me. I was screaming and yelling. But the phone rang, and she went from screaming and yelling and waving her stick to, hello? Hello? Yes, okay. Yeah, I'll do that later. Yeah, it'll be great. Yeah. Just like that black and white, that flip-flop, that exact like thing. She was not out of control. She was totally in control. And that happens a lot. It's not, I've never met a person yet who's kicked holes in the wall or punched holes in the wall and has hit a stud. They know where the studs are. They're thinking about it. They're planning ahead. And I don't know if they took a stud finder earlier and went along the wall to find the studs and then marked them so they could hit them or punch them or kick them and not get hurt. I don't know how that works. But very rare, I've never heard of anybody kicking a hole in the wall and breaking their foot because they hit a stud. There's a control there. There's something going on. You're just not out of control with emotions. They don't run your life. Your brains run your life, and your emotions just follow along afterwards. But there are times when, in the counseling process, I could say, okay, so this week I want you to read Psalm 119. It's really nice. But stuff needs to happen right now. This guy is an angry man, or this woman's an angry woman, and it's got to stop now. So I might say something like, in the name of Jesus Christ, stop it. You don't get to sin like this anymore. Stop it. If you sin like this again, I'm taking it to the elders, and we're going to suspend you from the Lord's Supper. You don't get to sin like this. You don't get to sin at all. You need to stop it right now. Sometimes they need, again, in addition to the regular homework that I just talked about, they need to keep a journal of what's going on. What happened? And answer those 7 questions. If you get angry this week, I want you to get those 7 questions that are there on your homework sheet and that we've talked about in here, and I want you to take the event that happened and answer all those 7 questions with that event, bring it in next week with you if you get angry. But you may not get angry. If you do, write it down, bring it back. Third, he needs to anticipate the times he's likely to become angry and prepare himself to love the other person instead of becoming angry, which is part of the 7 questions. But so you do the 7 questions if you blow it, and then the 7th question is, how am I going to prepare myself so that if this temptation comes again, I won't sin? But if you're in a home and you're angry with your family, it's happening all the time. So answer the question 7 and then get ready for it the next time it happens and do it again the right way. Then take it as a matter of faith that God will take care of the other person. Don't worry about them. You don't need to fix them. You can let it go. A lot of times people will say, if I let it go, it will never stop. It will always go. It'll keep on happening. If I don't say something to her about that, the way she's talking to me, she'll always talk to me that way. Well, let her talk to you that way. Let God get in there and mess with her. 5th, point out to him or her that this is a trial. God is giving you a trial to make you more godly. How about that? Looky there. You think of all the times that Paul's talking about being persecuted and all the suffering that he went through, being flogged and being stoned and put in prison and all the things that happened to him. And he views those things as trials. And he says James says to his people, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. Well, he's talking about that. People are doing mean things to you. Consider it a trial. Rejoice over it. God's using it to make you more godly. And then the sixth suggests that in the moment when the anger is not an issue, that he discuss the problem with his wife or his children or whatever. And do it in a way that builds them up and doesn't tear them down. So do it in a way that suggests positive ways to go about it rather than blaming or negative ways of what's going on. Every time you poke me in the eye, I feel this way. That's a bad way to do it. I said, how about next time when I bring this topic up, you say it this way? You have positive things to say about it so you can have an exchange of conversation and you don't get angry all over again. Finally, remind him to confess his sin honestly, confess it honestly, including what he meant to say, and to do all those terrible things because he has hatred in his heart. He's doing it on purpose. When you confess your sin, you need to actually confess your sin. Don't say, if I've ever said anything mean and nasty to you, please forgive me. Or if I've hurt you in any way by things I've said, please forgive me. He needs to be specific. I was awful to you. I was mean. I did it on purpose. I meant to hurt you. I'm not going to do it again either. We're going to work on that. We're going to talk about it. Let's talk about how not to do it. We got tempted. Let's not go there. Let's go on.